Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Over the past several years in the art market, Chinese private museums and foundations have been one of the dominant topics of conversation. As galleries expanded their collector base to Asia, they often prioritized these Chinese institutions, many of which had impressive acquisition budgets and stunning spaces for exhibitions. And to the frustration of many non-Chinese collectors, they frequently lost out on coveted artworks to these museums. But in recent years, coinciding with a softening art market, these Chinese foundations aren't discussed nearly as much. Galleries seem to bring them up less often, and collectors don't mention them as sources of competition like the way they used to. The truth is, China's private museum boom, once fueled by extraordinary wealth and ambition, seems to have reached a period of reckoning. Many institutions are now struggling to sustain attendance and funding and relevance amid a shifting cultural and economic landscape in China. So what exactly is happening? Some museums continue to thrive, but many are clearly facing challenges. We break all of this down in this week's episode with Cathy Fan, editor-in-chief of Artnet News China and co-author of the Asia Pivot. Cathy recently wrote an insightful and in-depth article about the reality check many of these museums are facing. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Cathy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Adam, for inviting.
Absolutely. Well, we really enjoyed your coverage of this phenomenon in Artnet News and definitely recommend to our listeners to read your article and are excited to have you here to chat a little bit further about it. So private museums in China, they really grew rapidly, maybe over the past 2 decades, but especially it seems over the past 5-10 years. Can you walk us through how did this sector exactly develop? Why was it so important to the Chinese art market? And how would you say these Chinese foundations and museums maybe differ from private museums in the US or Europe?
Absolutely. I think before the museum boom that we're talking about, there's actually the first wave of private museums in China. They actually started back in the early 90s. But some of the earliest was the individual from China, from China's reform and opening era, began building their own museums. But sadly, most of those museums that started early on, they don't last today. The real boom took off of the private museum in China took off in early 2000s. I think when China's real estate market and personal wealth started growing really fast, a lot of developers and entrepreneurs began funding private museums either to boost their reputation or as part of larger luxury projects. So these museums quickly filled a big gap in China's contemporary art scenes. For years, these museums played a key role in bringing international artists to Chinese audiences, and also they were supporting local artists too. Most importantly to me, I think they helped legitimize and expand the influence of art collecting, especially for those collectors who were just starting to build their taste and collections. Personally, I think these private museums also helped nurture the gallery ecosystem in China. Around the same time, we saw the places like 798 Art District in Beijing take off. In a way, these museums founders were some of the earliest pioneer in building cultural infrastructure in their own way. Their vision made global art world started to take China and its market more seriously, right? And after the launch of Art Basel Hong Kong, I think in 2013, that attention just accelerated. It became a two-way dynamic. China was learning from the global art world, but also being part of it, and even started to shaping it. And now about how this is different from the US and maybe Europe, that's actually one of the biggest reason I wrote this article. So in the West, private museums usually benefit from tax breaks, nonprofit status, or more institutional structure like boards or endowments. But in China, most private museums are still very much tied to a single funder, and their money, their taste, their vision. It's more about personal branding or social capital. So it's more complicated in China, where private museums can technically apply for nonprofit license, but some do receive benefits from that, like tax reduction or government funding support, especially if the museum is part of the real estate or development, or if they're considered part of larger public infrastructure. But in reality, only a few museums actually get nonprofit status. The process of applying can take years. The result is that many museums end up operating under a commercial structure for most of their lives. So when we talk about private museums in China, we're often talking about institutions that are running within a for-profit framework, even if their mission or programming looks like that of a nonprofit museum elsewhere.
And so in your article, you mentioned that despite the growth in the number of foundations that have been established in China, foundations, interestingly, were fragile from the start. What exactly did you mean by that? Is part of that pertaining to what you alluded to now in terms of how difficult it has been for them to obtain nonprofit status, or are there actually other factors you're alluding to as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. In China, there's a term that's often used when people talk about running a private institution. It's called 造血, which literally means and translated as generating your own blood or your own lifeline. In other words, if you want to survive, you need to find your own ways to generate your own revenue or find more revenue sources, right? So there's a need to do that. The need to do that often comes from the fact these institutions rely on a very narrow or single set of resources to begin with. Uh, Most private museums in China were heavily dependent on real estate money, like I said, either directly from the founder's personal wealth or from their company profits. That means they only had a single financial engine supporting them. So when the property market started to falling apart around 2020 after COVID, the whole foundation behind many of these museums just collapsed almost overnight. Um, then there's the issue of tax incentives, or rather the lack of them. As I mentioned earlier, in the US, if you donate to a museum, it can help you reduce your taxes. But in China, donation comes from most of the time comes from post-tax income, which makes it much harder to build a culture of wider patronage beyond just the funder. I remember Phil Tinari from UCCA told me in our interview earlier this year that they don't receive government funding. So many of the donation they received were driven by idealism or just, people's relationships. So on top of that, a lot of these museums were set up as for-profit entities, which ironically makes them ineligible for certain types of public funding. So when a crisis hits, they don't have a financial cushion or any institutional safety nets to fall back on. So that's why many museums are just constantly trying to find ways to generate revenue. They are raising ticket prices, also rent out event spaces, or they build merch lines. But even with all that effort, they often still cannot cover basic operating costs. So even though they're technically structured to make a profit, most of them aren't actually profitable. Many are stuck in kind of a vicious, what I call vicious cycle. So in recent years, many state-run museums and cultural venues in China have switched to free tickets, reservation-based entry. So they also have access to stable funding and institutional resources to host major exhibitions or borrow works or borrow exhibitions internationally. So this kind of a systematic support isn't available to private museums, which really highlights how fragile they're by comparison.
And so in your article, you wrote that the private museum space in China is experiencing a reckoning. Can you share some of the most prominent examples, maybe of some of these private museums that have closed or maybe are facing serious challenges?
Sure. Before I even started writing the article, I spent a long time trying to pinpoint three different cases. It's easy to find cases, but what are the most typical three? Not just to talk about, I don't want to just talk about failures, but to reflect the variety of realities and, the whole context that private museums in China are dealing with. Each case in my article reviews a different layer of problem. So I landed on these three. The first is UCCA, so arguably the most influential private museums in China. Even before my article came out, there had already been media reports putting UCCA in the spotlight. It has being one of the mature institution structure among all private museums in the country. So it's also rare to have multiple branches like UCCA. So UCCA have UCCA Dune in Beidaihe, which is 2 hour drive from Beijing. It has UCCA Edge in Shanghai, and its recent add-on is UCCA Clay. And it also has UCCA Lab. It's a commercial curatorial department that partner with brands or on crossover exhibitions. I think it also boasts one of the most enviable boards, like museum boards in China's museum world. But despite all that, it hasn't been immune to financial pressure. As a broader economy slows down in China, both corporate sponsors and private donors have pulled back significantly. Revenue from brands or partnerships has also dropped. So the influence of UCCA alone cannot just solve the crisis. In many ways, UCCA's situation highlights a bigger issue, which is the lack of a sustainable structure framework for private museums in China, no matter how established they are. And in my article, the second case I chose is Tag Art Museum in Qingdao. From its opening to closure, the entire time span of this institution lasted less than 4 years. Tag was a classic case of love and hate relationship between art and real estate in China. It was designed by a star architect, Jean Nouveau, and positioned as China's most beautiful seaside museum. But there's also I would call a very China-specific keyword here, which is policy. In China, one government directive can quickly change the course of an entire project. TAG was originally built as a cultural companion to a planned satellite campus of Central Academy of Fine Art in Qingdao in the city. That campus would have brought a broader ecosystem for TAG to plug into. But in 2021, Chinese education policy shifted. Universities would no longer be encouraged or even allowed to build branch campuses in other provinces. So Central Academy had to abandon this project. So eventually, what we see here is TAG lacked the support network and also the structure to continue to survive. So there's one more case that I chose in my article, which is Times Museum in Guangzhou. This is one of the most important independent institutions in South China, with a deep ties to local artist communities and a great reputation for its curatorial programs. In 2022, this museum faced a major crisis and had to stop all operation after its real estate banker put all the funding. So it was a real shock to the entire art world in China. But earlier this year, we see Times Museum made a comeback. It was not through a big donor or governmental payout, but through grassroots support. Over 60 artists donated their works to a charity auction just to help the museum to reopen. The institution has relaunched a smaller scale exhibition and very community-driven programs. So the model is, I think the model of Times Museum in Guangzhou is now slower and it's more rooted in local engagement, but it's working. It's a different kind of story, and I think it could inspire other institutions navigating this, throughout these uncertain times.
So I think what's interesting is that during the last several years, people who are based in the West, whether they're collectors or advisors, a lot of their experiences with these Chinese private museums have come during conversations actually with galleries who inform them that they're prioritizing Asian museums or foundations during the allocation process, which certainly has been a bit frustrating. Now, that rhetoric seems to have faded for some of the reasons we've discussed. What would you say about the Chinese private museum struggles and how that actually impacts certain wider ecosystems, whether we're talking about the Chinese art market or even the broader art market and collectors and artists and galleries and even auction houses? Are you seeing a kind of ripple effect internationally?
Yeah, apparently the short-term impact is already very visible. In some cities, these private museums weren't just art spaces. They became iconic landmarks, shaping, the whole surrounding art ecosystem. Like in the city where I come from, Chengdu, there's A4 Art Museum, and people are always going there. Like it's very important to the city. So when when those museums shut down, it's not an isolated event. It triggers a kind of domino effect. So private museums used to be among a few places where emerging artists could gain visibility and, build their CVs and connect with the creators and collectors. Many of the museums supported more experimental or research-driven projects that commercial galleries couldn't take on. Now, this kind of spaces has shrunk dramatically, right? For galleries, this shift means fewer institution acquisitions, of course, and less predictable income. Many galleries counted on museum purchases as stable part of their business model. Now they're pivoting more aggressively toward private collectors, but those collectors are becoming increasingly cautious. It's not uncommon to hear about someone who used to buy regularly, but now is pulling back, either because their primary business is under pressure or because collecting art isn't just priority anymore for them. If I had to sum it up in one phrase, I'd say we're saying what we are seeing here is a real loss of confidence. There's, I think there's a deeper psychology shift, no, psychological shift. Dealers abroad who sell important artworks to Chinese institutions because they actually believed in their longevity and symbolic value, but that could be fading now. Dealers they're asking, will this work be preserved properly? Will it remain on view remain in this collection for a long term? Or could the museum shut down or pivot entirely in just a few years? And I think auction house is also feeling the pressure too. Institutional provenance used to be a powerful tool for boosting market value. But when the cultural narrative breaks down, so does the confidence in the secondary market. And if we look at the crisis internationally, the ripple effects are very real. China is still one of the most important art market in the world. But now international institutions are more cautious when considering partnerships. They're asking tougher questions about long-term sustainability, professionalism, and what I believe is the most important, most critical factor, the policy uncertainty, as I just mentioned.
And so as we look forward, what do you think the future may hold for Chinese private museums? Do you expect any types of major changes, perhaps, in the museum model in China that might emerge in the future in order for these museums to be more sustainable and really for more of them to thrive in the long term?
Yeah, before I get into the future, I just want to say there's no need to be overly pessimistic. Yes, the challenges are real and the reality is uncertain for sure, but I think we can remain cautiously optimistic. The broader market moves in, it always moves in cycles. So I do believe there's resilience built into the system. Also, we have to remember China's contemporary art world and its market have compressed with what took the West many decades into just 20 years or 30 years. It's like a sponge being squeezed and expanded quickly. It absorbed a lot, learned fast, often through aggressive, growth and experimentation. And now it's entering a phase of reflection and adjustment. Whether this period leads to a true structural reform remains to be seen, but we shouldn't count it out, right? Looking ahead, I do think private museums will continue to exist in China, but it probably won't be another boom. Instead of a wave of new openings in a short span, well, we will likely see a slower, more considered approach. Some entrepreneurs and collectors may choose what I would call a more community-based slow model. One good example is the Times Museum in Guangzhou. It's not about spectaculars or scales anymore, but now it is more about meaningful engagement and careful. Also, what's equally important is careful cost control and also the cultural relevance. They're doing more with less and using tools like social media to amplify the reach. And what's interesting in China is we're seeing a new hybrid models. Some institutions are becoming more commercial curatorial in nature, like I said, they're doing brand collaborations. For example, UCC Lab is a good example of this kind of pivot. They're trying educational programs, and they're they're stepping into lifestyle events, all of which help with the financial sustainability. And importantly, I think some of the collectors are moving away from the term museum altogether. I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. Instead, we're seeing, more foundations or spaces being set up. They're lighter, they're more flexible, they're more personalized. This may be housed in existing properties of whether they can be residential or commercial, but still allow for high quality exhibitions, public programs. For collectors who want to build something meaningful without taking on the risks or cost of a full scale museum, this is becoming a more attractive path for them. So it's more intimate with the art world insider, and it's more meaningful for those true art lovers. So in Beijing, for instance, there's a bunch of new foundations. There's Zhi Foundation, and in Shanghai we see ASE Foundation. They have impressed me with its presentation, with its clarity of vision. So these kind of projects show that even in challenging environment, people are still finding creative, adaptive ways to contribute to the cultural landscape. So yes, to answer your question, the future comes with the challenges, but it also holds surprises, right? Thanks. We have to thank to those people who are willing to adjust, to adapt, to rethink, and they're always innovating. And that gives me a lot of hope, I think.
Cathy, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and sharing your really unique perspective on everything happening with Chinese private museums over the last several years. And if our listeners want to learn more, I definitely recommend they check out your coverage at Artnet News. And where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram under Cathy, CATHYFXY. Yeah.
Great. Thanks again, Cathy. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam.